Back in part 1 of our look at Spaceship Earth, we talked pretty extensively about the development process behind the attraction. Really, just a deep dive on all the ideas that were behind the ride, where and who they came from, as well as how they were changed throughout that whole process, leading up to its construction and the park's opening. So now with part 2, we'll be continuing by focusing specifically on the changes it's seen post-opening. And even more specifically, this video will be about the attraction's first 2 versions, opening in 1982 and 1986 respectively. Now, bear in mind here that there are 2 other versions that came after these as well, both of which we'll cover in depth with the 3rd and final installment of this series next, so don't worry about that. But this part is going to have us looking at that original ride experience, as it was within the attraction's first decade, not only to get us more familiar with the ride, so we can better talk about the rest of its changes later, but also to compare it to some of the concepts we touched on back in part 1, since these 2 iterations of Spaceship Earth have some of the biggest connections to those original Bradbury ideas. So, to best cover all that, we're going to start off by taking a ride on one of the early versions. Not the first one exactly, but close enough to it. And of course, I'll also explain why we're starting here with the 2nd version later on as well. So, without any more waiting around, let's hop on board and check this thing out. As the ride begins, the first thing we experience is the lift up into the attraction's gigantic sphere, taking us all the way back to the beginning of time, as we make a slow climb through prehistoric darkness, all of course accentuated by the iconic narration of Walter Cronkite.
For eons, our planet has drifted as a spaceship through the universe. And for a brief moment, we have been its passengers.
Eventually landing us in the attraction's first scene, where we can see a few creatures begin to appear in this sort of abstract projection effect. Interestingly, this was actually one of the leftover effects from that whole cut opening sequence in the original script, which would have heavily relied on projections to showcase everything it described. Eventually though, show designers just decided to start the ride with the cavemen part that came after it, but not before reusing some of the projection technology and even art direction from that sequence here, where it acts as a great little setup for the ride's real first scene, where we see the cavemen.
We have reached the dawn of recorded time, an age when mammoth creatures roam the land. But with spoken language, the ancient hunters learned to work together and meet the challenges of this hostile world.
Continuing into that next scene, we see written knowledge as it was first preserved, as primitive paintings on cave walls, which were later passed on to future generations, not only ensuring their survival, but also that of the entire species. And after that, we then jump ahead to ancient Egypt, and are told about their use of hieroglyphics and papyrus, along with what effects they both had on the civilizations of that era.
Ages later, stories and knowledge are transcribed in complex pictures and symbols. Hieroglyphics mark the rise of written language, and soon with papyrus scrolls, the written word begins to travel out across the land.
Which of course transitions nicely into the Phoenicians, and their use of a common alphabet.
The value of writing for accurate record-keeping appeals to Phoenician merchants. They create an alphabet, simple enough for any to learn, and share this new tool at ports along the Mediterranean.
Now, pretty much all the scenes we've gone over so far were taken directly from the ride's original script, even down to the staging of them, looking almost exactly like some of the concept art we saw back in part 1. It isn't until after we get past those first few set pieces that we begin to see some of the newer concepts from later in development, roughly around the same time they switch from the original model to the new spherical one. For example, the next scene following the Phoenicians takes us directly to ancient Greece, where we see a few people performing Oedipus Rex, the Athenian tragedy by Sophocles. At first, when Imagineers created the new Greece segment for the ride, it was intended to focus on stuff like their advancements in science, academics, and philosophy, all of which were made possible by the creation of a common alphabet and ability to share information amongst different cultures. obviously a result of the Phoenicians, which was why the two were originally combined in Bradbury's script. But sometime around the late 70s, the scene was changed to instead showcase a piece of their theatrical tradition, another side effect of widespread communication and growth of civilization that isn't talked about as much as all the scholarly stuff. Continuing from there, our next stop naturally is with the Romans, who continue the theme of disseminating info through the forging of their very own empire.
The Romans built a mighty system of roads, a long-distance network to carry laws and tidings over a far-reaching empire.
And the fall of Rome is also shown as well, now to illustrate one of the first collective losses of human knowledge, along with the aftermath of it.
Glorious Rome falls victim to the flames of excess. Ages of knowledge are lost or forgotten in the ashes. But all is not lost, for Islamic and Jewish scholars continue to preserve ancient wisdom in noble libraries. In their travels, they record knowledge and share their findings with cultures east and west.
Again, much like the Greeks, this portion of the ride isn't anywhere to be found in the original script or early concept art, and was very likely a later invention of show designers to help bridge the gap between ancient times and the Middle Ages. Speaking of which, our next scene brings us into medieval Europe, where the invention of the printing press helps to bring about the Renaissance.
The dawn of the Renaissance brings a wondrous new machine, the printing press. Now books and authors flourish as never before.
Very similar to the Oedipus Rex vignette we saw earlier, this section does a great job of showing how a new sense of artistry can be born from the ability to share knowledge, helping shape a society's culture and directly influencing its history.
The Renaissance, a time of renewed interest in the worlds of poetry and music, science, philosophy, and art. Behold the majesty of the Sistine ceiling.
After that, our next big jump takes us all the way to a post-Civil War North America, where communications technology begins to grow rapidly, shown through the use of new industrial-sized printing presses, telegrams and telephones, as well as radio, film, and television, all of which aid in the large-scale spreading of information that was taking place throughout the late 19th and early 20th century. And that sense of growing technology leads us into humanity's next big invention, the computer, along with what implications it has for the future of information.
Instant communications create an ever-increasing flow of facts and figures. To manage this growing storehouse of information, we invent the computer. Today, we're merging the technologies of communications and computers to store, process, and share information.
From there, the ride's final few scenes borrow heavily from Bradbury's script, as we enter into a tunnel full of colorful lights, and then find ourselves in space after that, looking back at a giant communication satellite, both of which are ideas you can trace back to him in 1977, albeit with a slightly different context here. And that's really the best way to describe how most of Bradbury's concepts ended up in the final ride. The same kind of idea, with just a little bit different presentation. Again, this was the result of that final wave of story rewrites from the late 70s, by which time Bradbury had already left the project to help work on Epcot's cancelled Space Pavilion, leaving Imagineers to try and piece together all the conceptual scraps that he left behind, throwing out what didn't fit or wasn't finished, keeping what did, and trying to glue it all together with some new narration and scripting, which is why the attraction we just went over feels so much like the one we heard described in Part 1, despite the very obvious differences between them. However, you'll have to keep in mind that we started with the 1986 version of Spaceship Earth, mostly because those first two versions were largely the same scene-wise, and the lack of good quality footage and audio recorded of the original would have made starting there pretty difficult. But right now, I want to jump back to that first version real quick, now that we're a little more familiar with what it turned into, so we can compare some of the differences between them. Now, for the most part, we'll be looking at the changes that happen with the attraction's new narration and script, not really the scene updates that it underwent, with certain parts and figures getting moved around. All those more superficial changes we're saving for part 3. For this next section, we'll be exploring how the original 1982 version of the attraction relates back to the script from 1977, as well as how the second version of the ride that we just saw carries over a lot of those same ideas as well. And surprisingly, the connections start out pretty early, with the original narrator's opening line borrowing quite a few hallmarks from Bradbury.
Where have we come from? Where are we going? The answers begin in our past, in the dust from which we were formed. Answers recorded on the walls of time. So let us journey into that past, to seek those walls, to know ourselves and to probe the destiny of our Spaceship Earth.
And this brings us back to the concept of the Universal Man, a character who is slated to act as the ride's original narrator, representing the entire essence of humanity, including all those who have ever lived. Interestingly, while it's never explicitly stated in the actual ride itself, the Universal Man does seem to be who narrates the 1982 version of the attraction, as evidenced by the many similarities you can find between his narration and what Bradbury wrote, including a line directly after that opening one, which is almost verbatim taken from the old script.
Now, suns reverse, moons rephase. Let us return to ancient caves, where first we learn to share our thoughts and to survive.
Really, one of the biggest casualties from Spaceship Earth's first update was the removal of this original narration by Vic Perrin, and the replacing of him with Walter Cronkite, because the latter's new narration pretty much completely abandoned the character of the Universal Man, now just having a famous broadcaster reading very similar lines, which really makes a big difference in how even the most closely related pieces of dialogue from both versions take on a completely different tone.
On cave walls we inscribe our greatest triumphs, a growing record of our deeds to share with others, so they too may meet tomorrow someday. Ages pass, and more walls rise in the valley of the Nile. Then with new symbols we unlock our thoughts from chiseled walls and send them forth on papyrus scrolls.
Admittedly though, the direct relations between the 1982 narration and Bradbury's script are pretty limited, and the original version of the ride has a lot more in common with the 1987 version than it does with the 1977 version, mostly because Cronkite's new narration was mainly based on that first iteration. In fact, it's also the same reason that most people consider the second version of the attraction to really be the perfected version of the original, since it really didn't change all that much about it, as much as it did simplify a lot of the same older ideas. For example, the original 1982 Grease scene is a little bit more detailed with its presentation, even listing off the names of people it was inspired by.
Deep in the shadows of Mount Olympus, our alphabet takes root, flowering with new expression. Hail the proud Greeks, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. The theater is born.
Whereas the 1986 version makes the whole thing a lot more concise and to the point, only now just losing some of that bigger context.
In classic Greece, the alphabet grows and flowers with new expression, and a new stage of storytelling emerges. A stage on which we examine our world and ourselves. The theater is born.
All in all, it's really fascinating to see what pieces of the narration stuck around through the first set of changes, and it really gives you some insight into which parts they thought were more impactful, like the Flames of Excess line that appears in both versions of the Rome scene.
Glorious Rome, until consumed by the flames of excess. Imperial Rome, lost in the ashes of darkness.
And along with that, a few parts from the whole Renaissance portion can also be heard between the two as well.
As our minds soar, our hands find new expression in the flourishing world of art. Behold the majesty of the Sistine ceiling.
For the most part, things stay pretty much the same throughout both the Industrial Revolution and 20th century scenes, and they don't get all that interesting again until we reach the space segment of this version, which actually takes us back to Bradbury's script in a really big way. First, by setting us up with a piece of narration about the Earth that was directly inspired by the two astronaut quotes that preface the original script, both of which refer to the planet as a small and fragile thing.
Poised on the threshold of infinity, we see our world as it truly is. Small, silent, fragile, alive, a drifting island in the midnight sky. It is our Spaceship Earth.
And this was a huge idea throughout the ride's early development, heavily based on those old Buckminster Fuller ideas of a Spaceship Earth, which definitely influenced most of the themes we saw from Bradbury early on. And here they are manifested in the purest sense, now with our Universal Man character directly challenging us to work towards building a better Spaceship Earth, another idea that can be traced back to that first script.
Now our future world draws near. Face the challenge of tomorrow. We must return and take command of our Spaceship Earth, to become captains of our own destiny, to reach out and fulfill our dreams.
Plus, they even take it a step further, by reintroducing the concept of Future World being directly connected to the ride experience, where it acts as a continuation of the same futuristic ideals we just saw play out via communication, only now with that pavilion's respective industry. Again, bringing out the sense that Spaceship Earth as an experience was really an introductory statement for the rest of the park.
Tomorrow's world approaches. So let us listen and learn. Let us explore and question and understand. Let us go forth and discover the wisdom to guide great Spaceship Earth through the uncharted seas of the future. Let us dare to fulfill our destiny.
This whole portion was really one of the biggest connections the final ride carried over from Bradbury, and it's easy to see why, since it truly helps establish not just the purpose of this attraction, but also the whole of Epcot Center, and every optimistic dream of the future that was wrapped up in the park back then. And I'd be lying if I said a lot of those same concepts didn't make their way into the Cronkite version too, especially towards the end of the ride, because despite simplifying a lot of its earlier ideas, the 1986 version did keep a lot of what mattered, and this was thanks to Imagineer Tom Fitzgerald, who, when rewriting that original attraction in 1986, still managed to retain the same spirit of what Bradbury had envisioned, only now just stripping away a lot of the more esoteric stuff that came with that first version. Less of Bradbury's more science fiction kind of influence, and more of that classic Epcot sort of vibe from the early 80s. The best example of which can be heard with the song Tomorrow's Child, a piece written specifically for the 1986 version's descent tunnel, which replaced most of the finale narration we just heard a few minutes ago. At first glance, something like that might just seem like some classic Disney-fying of old Epcot ideas, but if you actually listen to the lyrics, it manages to capture an idea from Bradbury that he never even put into the script, but was a major source of inspiration for his work on the attraction.
Holding the spark as we embark on a great journey together, we're learning to reach for hope and desire, building a world to inspire. Tomorrow's child, charting a brand new way, for the future world is born today.
I think it's important to build something like Epcot, or for that matter, Disney World or Disneyland, because we attract young people and old people who haven't made up their minds about the future. So therefore, the kids come in, as we all do at a certain age, looking for their own futures there. And somewhere along the line, we are passed through the experience. I look upon the Epcot Center itself, at the very center of it, the Spaceship Earth, as a kind of Schweitzer centrifuge. So if you put the children in this centrifuge of Spaceship Earth and whirl them around, filled with the ideas of the far past, the immediate present, and the far future, they'll come out galvanized and care very much about getting out of bed tomorrow morning. That's what you must do for children. The educational process must do it, teachers must do it, and we must do it. And let's be there ahead of the teachers this time, huh? Let's say to the children, for God's sake, the future is worth building.
It just goes to show how ideas, even ones that were abandoned or forgotten during development, can reappear years down the line and redefine the ride experience. And that isn't just limited to these first two versions of it either, as both the 1994 and even the 2007 ones each have their own examples of similarities to the older concepts. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves yet, because when we come back for part 3, we'll not only cover all that, but also how Spaceship Earth evolved through updates to its ride scenes, not just the narration like these first two versions were mostly limited to. But again, that'll all just have to be a story for next time.